Across Russia, we are seeing the war machine jam up. Ukrainian strikes hit every artery that keeps the Kremlin alive. Black Sea tankers were stopped cold in Tuapse as well as Novorossiysk. Every hour that they are idle drains millions from Putin's war chest. At the same time, a Russian Su-34, it was blasted out of the skies near Zaporizhzhia. That's important. That is a jet that had been bombing Ukrainian cities. But today, it is wreckage. In Crimea, 2 transport planes and a coastal radar were also destroyed. That means that now troops can't move, supplies cannot flow, and the blind spots for Russia are growing. In occupied Luhansk, gas nodes there were hit and power plants were forced to go into using coal. Factories now are having flickering lights across the region. Banks in occupied Sevastopol, they've frozen. In fact, the ATMs have stopped working, meaning that families can no longer move their money. These are not random blows. They are connected. They are interrelated. And they are all symptoms of a terrible illness that has come to the Kremlin. It is, in fact, fatal for the Putin regime. Because right now, there is not one node of Russia that is working correctly. It is falling apart. Economically, politically, and militarily. And today, it is going to get yet even worse for the Kremlin war machine. My name is Jason Smart, and I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and a national security advisor. What we're seeing right now in Russia is pretty phenomenal because it is very clearly getting much worse, much faster than many of us would have anticipated. Now, of course, for weeks and months, Ukraine has carried out regular attacks within Russia. However, the quantity of them has never been so high. At least I cannot remember the last time that we saw this many attacks, these many things going wrong at the same time. And what's really phenomenal about it is that the Kremlin tries to act like everything is normal. The fact is that it is not normal. It is very not normal. And right now, the Kremlin is being squeezed. It has less policy choices than it had before. We saw that earlier Moscow had extended its ban on gasoline exports. Now it's going to have to extend that even further because it's not just the central part of the country, but even Moscow, even St. Petersburg, that lack gasoline. Just imagine what that does to your economy. Imagine what chaos there is when there's a snowstorm or another thing like that. Now imagine this. This is not regional. It's not part of the country. It is the entire country that lacks gasoline. How do you continue operating? How do you keep the show on the road? Look at Sevastopol. The ATMs there of Bank Rossiya, as well as VTB, some of the biggest banks in all of Russia, they're refusing deposits. They simply cannot use the machines. So people cannot put money into their accounts, which means they cannot pay their bills on time. Typically in Russia, people have cash. They deposit just what they need in order to pay their bills, their electricity, their utilities, and the rest they keep in cash. But now, they can't even do that, which means their utilities will get cut off. But it also means that soldiers, their families, are unable to access their money. These are all things that are counting against the Putin regime that diminish the public's faith that things are under control. As you've seen if you've followed this program before, things are not under control. And that is despite the fact that oftentimes in the press, they behave as if Russia is a stable country. But quite clearly, nothing can be further from the truth. So help me get this message out to more people, the truth of what is happening inside of Russia and how the situation really is inside of Ukraine, a country that is much smaller than Russia, but is winning. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member today, and also leave your comments below about how you see the situation today. So let's look at these ongoing problems that they're facing. We see that in Luhansk, which is one of the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine, there are some serious problems. Specifically, power reliability is now faltering. We saw that across different parts of the region, such as Scarcity, Severodonetsk, Novokopsk, there was a problem with gas distribution. And that's because they were hit. They were attacked. But now, without power, things get very complicated. Remember, those occupied territories, Donetsk, and Luhansk have significant problems with the lack of water. In fact, they typically only get running water once every 2 to 3 days for a couple of hours. And the water, from the videos I've seen, it does not look like something you'd want to drink. So they've got significant problems. But why does this matter? For the war, why does this matter? Because if you're planning to do an offensive sometime soon, it might be very convenient there's no electricity. It might be convenient that there's no running water. And there's less civilians in place. Just soldiers. Soldiers who lack water and lack electricity. So though we don't know what Ukraine is next planning, we could probably assume that there is very good news in the near future coming from the occupied territories. Let's look at Ukraine's attacks on some of the factories that is also changing how this war has been fought. Look at the attack in Krasnodar Krai on the factory there. So that factory was being used to create things for the farms as well as factories across the regions. But it was a very important one because it was one of a kind for some of the chemicals that are produced. What that means in real terms is that there's going to then be fewer shipments, higher cost, and slower deliveries. That ripples across everything, as well as food, manufacturing, but also the military-industrial complex. These delays will also cut the amount of cash, the amount of availability there is in a market that is already very tight on cash. Russia doesn't have a lot of good options. And if you're a Russian, I would imagine you're looking out and seeing a disaster unfold. Consider the fact that something as the attack that took down the Russian Su-34, it was shot down near Zaporizhzhia. What's amazing is that that specific Su, that specific pilot, had fired guided bombs on Ukrainian cities. It had attacked Ukrainian positions. They saw their airplane go down. In occupied Crimea, we saw something even more incredible. Ukrainian GUR, which is military intelligence, carried out a hit in Prizak. 2 Antonov 26s, which are transport planes, were burned on the tarmac. What's more incredible is they took out a coastal watch radar site. That's very important. So in the case of the airplanes, the Russians already lack spare parts. They're struggling already to move their troops, to move all of the supplies for their military. But now it's just going to get harder. But more important, the attack on the radar. The attack on the radar means that Russia is ever more blind. As we've discussed many times, I think there is no coincidence here that Ukraine is taking out radar regularly in Crimea. Increasingly, it looks like Crimea is in play. But look at the pressure within Russia, the pressure that the average people are starting to see, and something that the Kremlin should most certainly be very worried about. Look at the attacks by ATESH. Look at the attacks by this partisan group of Russians fighting against the Putin regime in Berdyansk. So a fuel truck there as well as a utility vehicle were destroyed. And what's interesting about this is that it is not the first, not the second, not the 20th, not the 50th attack by ATESH. ATESH regularly is carrying out attacks, partisan attacks, deep inside of Russia. The Russian government doesn't know what to do. It can't admit that there are partisans in their country. It certainly can't admit that they don't even have a finger on the pulse. They don't have any idea how to stop them or where to find them. No one from ATESH is being arrested. Now, how does the government that says that it's winning in Ukraine, but everybody sees its airplanes being shot down or its airplanes burning on the tarmac, and it sees that it's being forced out of villages in Ukraine, how does it say that we have full control in Ukraine or even full control in Russia when you see that there are partisans blowing up things on a regular basis? How can you look at that and think that things are going well? Quite clearly, things are going very not well. Within Russia itself, though, there's another factor, and that is the economy. The economy is limping along under the strain of war. Growth has slowed to near zero in 2025, and the forecasts have dropped even further. Regularly, the government now is updating its forecast to show that it's expecting more losses. The government today has almost no buffer. It has no ability to cover the rising cost of this war. Keep in mind that inflation continues while the production is stalling. Prices are rising even as output weakens. That means that today, households feel poor. The state is struggling. It cannot collect enough revenue. Debt service and defense spending are eating up the entire budget. More money today is going to the war and paying interest on loans. That means that there's less money for the schools, for the hospitals, for the civilians. And there's not a lot of hope about money in Russia. Let's just think about the banks themselves. Russian banks are running short of liquidity. They are running out of the lifeblood for their economy. Now, the liquidity shortages specifically are growing across the entire banking system. Deposits held at the central bank have fallen, and that is why funding gaps today are widening. What this means is that the banks have less cash on hand. That means that they cannot lend the money to people, but they can also not allow people to withdraw their own money. Keep in mind that the central bank today is running weekly repo auctions to plug these holes. Before, the stress auctions were less frequent. They would occur, but they were very small. But today, it's become normalized. That's actually not a good thing. It is very bad when the central bank thinks it's normal that it has to give money to the banks to make sure that there's not runs on the banks, that the banks don't run out of cash and unable to service their clients. That is a very bad sign. Today, we see that they are scrambling. They don't know how to make ends meet, and they're trying to prevent a public panic. But there's a very good reason to have a public panic, and that's because things are getting much worse. Look at this. Bad loans are rising very quickly across Russia. Borrowers today are struggling with high rates. Today, we see that these delinquencies in the banking sector are eroding the bank's capital. This is reducing the lending capacity. And that means that the credit for factories and suppliers, it's becoming very limited. It's becoming something that most cannot afford. Then how is Russia to continue? How can Russia continue fighting a war if it doesn't have cash? If even its banks lack cash? How can it fight a war if Ukraine is destroying its only ability to generate revenue? That is by attacking the oil industry. This is why more and more, look at these numbers, look at these facts coming out. There is not an argument to be made that things are okay in Russia, that Russia will scoot through. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. These different economic and banking pressures are feeding straight into the Kremlin's ability to pay the war. It cannot pay for it. A weak economy is bringing in less taxes. It's having fewer exports. Less revenue makes it harder for the Kremlin. Less oil exports makes it even harder. But today, those exports are in decline. The export of gasoline is forbidden. There is nothing going well for the Russian economy. But there's something else important here. Russia has abused its banks for months and months, taking out money to pay for the war. The war was put as the top priority. But that's a problem, because banks that lack liquidity, they stop lending, even to the industries such as the defense industry. So military contractors cannot get working capital for parts or for the payroll. That means that the repairs are slowed down, procurement slips, and units wait longer for supplies. And this all fits into something larger, that higher debt service crowds out logistics. More rubles are going to go eventually to the interest rates and to paying down the loans. But little of it is going to go to the spare parts, which they so desperately need. That means that there are today less ready vehicles, fewer flights that can be taken by Russian aircraft. Everything ties together. And that is the point that I wish to drive more than any other, is that all of this is a working system, interconnected. The Russian economy falling apart is something that doesn't just affect consumers, that affects very clearly, very directly, the Russian military. But the Russian military, having loss after loss, not being able to fight, guarantees that those banks will not get their money back. That means those banks become further destabilized. But the population as a whole, suffering with greater losses, with more instability, has less faith in the government. And when it has less faith in the government, that puts the Kremlin in a situation of having to worry about domestic problems, such as ATESH rising up and having people within Russia trying to overthrow the Putin regime. All of these things work together against the Kremlin. And as I've said before, and I'll repeat now, think about the news you've read in the past week inside of Ukraine. You have not seen that there are attacks on the banking sector or that the banking sector is collapsing. You've not seen that Ukraine is losing territory. You have not seen that Ukraine is facing the types of attacks that Russia is. Russia is in a very bad situation. But the good news is that it will get even worse. And if you wish to help make things worse in Russia, I'll put a link in the first comment below, which I'll pin, so that you can donate for Ukraine to get more drones, life-saving drones that help the Ukrainian soldiers keep fighting. So today we are seeing that in Russia it is a disaster. Exports are failing. Cash is drying up. The cash drying up means that the banks are weakened. The weakened banks means that industry slows. Industry slowing means that the army can fight, but with much less, which thereby makes them lose more, which then spreads panic. It spreads emergency responses. And all in all, the pattern is clear. Things get worse, not better. Today, the bottom line is simple. A war that loses oil cash, reliable banking, and steady power cannot continue. A country that has no economy cannot fight a war. A military that does not have supplies will not win. But today, a home front in Russia that's being forced to evacuate its factories, evacuate its beaches, evacuate even its civilian areas, is not a country that has control over its own territory. But today, a system like Russia's, that's under all of these unique pressures, one after another, is not able to fight an offensive war. At this stage, it cannot even fight a defensive war. Today, the Kremlin is doing damage control. But that damage control, really, is trying to slow down the decay of a very corrupt and broken system. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. And consider becoming a channel member today. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.